The restaurant went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise. It was the kind of silence that travels, table to table, glass to glass, until everyone in the room is looking at the same thing without quite knowing why. And what they were looking at, on that particular Friday evening in late October, was a man standing at the entrance of Lonsdale & Co., one of the most expensive restaurants in Vancouver, wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had lost its color entirely. His name was Norman Fitch. He was 58 years old. He had driven there in a 2003 Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a passenger seat permanently reclined because the lever had broken sometime around 2019, and he'd never gotten around to fixing it. He stood at the hostess podium with his hands in the front pockets of his jeans. Not embarrassed, not defiant, simply present, waiting the way a man waits for a bus he knows will come. The hostess, a young woman named Brianna, glanced at his shirt and then at her seating chart, and then at his shirt again. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, with the carefully managed tone of someone hoping the answer would make a problem disappear. "Yes," Norman said. "Fitch, 7 o'clock. She found it. Of course she found it. He'd made it 6 weeks ago." 3 tables away, Catherine Aldrin watched this exchange with the particular attention of someone who has spent 20 years learning how to read a room. She was the regional vice president of a hospitality investment group that had partial ownership of Lonsdale & Co., among 11 other properties across British Columbia and Alberta. She was 44 years old, composed in the way that only comes from discipline rather than ease, and she was currently hosting a dinner for her company's newest board member and his wife. She noticed the flannel shirt. She noticed the cracked sole boots. She noticed the way Brianna hesitated, and she noticed the way the man simply waited, unbothered, as though the hesitation had nothing to do with him. She leaned slightly toward her colleague Malcolm and said, quietly enough, "I wonder if he wandered in thinking this was the pub down the street." Malcolm laughed. So did the board member's wife. Catherine hadn't said it to be cruel. That was the thing about her. She rarely did anything to be cruel. She said it because it was the kind of small observational remark that made a table feel like an insider's circle, and she was very good at that. She had built a career on making people feel they were in the right room. She didn't think about it again. Norman was seated in a corner table, and the room's attention drifted back to its own conversations, and Catherine turned to ask the board member about his daughter's semester in Montreal. Norman had come to Lonsdale & Co. for one reason. His son was getting engaged. His son's name was James. James Fitch was 31 and worked in urban planning for the city of Vancouver, and he had met a woman named Rosalind Cheng at a conference in Ottawa 2 years earlier. And they had been, in James's own words, embarrassingly happy ever since. The engagement dinner was James's idea, small, just the two of them and their families, and he'd asked his father to choose the restaurant. Norman had chosen Lonsdale because Rosalind's parents, Howard and Maylin Cheng, lived in Shaughnessy, and he'd heard from James that they liked French-influenced menus. He'd looked at the reviews and booked the corner table because James had mentioned once, years ago, that he hated sitting in the middle of restaurants. Norman remembered things like that. He was that kind of father. He sat alone for a few minutes before the others arrived, and he ordered sparkling water, and he looked out the window at Granville Street in the rain. And he thought about James's mother, who had died 11 years ago and who would have been, he knew with certainty, entirely overdressed for this occasion and completely delightful. When James arrived with Rosalind and her parents, Howard Cheng extended his hand and introduced himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being the most established person in any room. He was a cardiologist. His wife, Maylin, was an architect who had done significant residential work in West Vancouver. They were gracious, warm people, and they looked at Norman's flannel shirt with only the briefest pause before smiling and sitting down. Dinner was wonderful. Norman said very little. He always said very little. He asked Maylin about her current project, and she was pleased to tell him, and he asked questions that made it clear he understood what she was describing. Howard attempted to ask Norman what he did for work, in the gentle, diplomatic way one asks a question when one is prepared for the answer to be unfortunate. "I work with land," Norman said. "Farming?" Howard asked. "Development," Norman said, "mostly rural." "A bit of timberland," Howard nodded pleasantly. James, who had heard this exchange approximately 100 times in his life, looked at his wine glass and said nothing. Rosalind, who was perceptive and had been studying Norman Fitch since she first heard James describe him, watched her father accept this incomplete answer and file it under modest occupation and move on to other topics. After dinner, James hugged his father in the lobby and said, "You didn't have to pick somewhere this nice. You only get engaged once," Norman said. "Theoretically," James said, and Norman smiled. He drove home in the rain with the passenger seat reclined at its permanent angle, and he thought it had been a good evening and he slept well. The charity gala was Catherine Aldrin's event. She ran it every year, a fundraiser for a children's literacy foundation that was genuinely close to her heart. One of the few things in her professional life that was not complicated by ambition or calculation. She had organized it for 6 years. It was held in the ballroom of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, and it raised on average just over $400,000 annually. She was proud of it in a way she was not quite proud of anything else she did. This year there was a complication. The gala's primary sponsor, a real estate development group called Pacific Meridian, had pulled out in September due to an internal restructuring, leaving a gap of $200,000 3 weeks before the event. Catherine had spent October making calls. She had called everyone she knew. She had a long list of people she knew. Her events coordinator, a practical woman named Sasha, suggested reaching out to a smaller firm called Harrow Land Consultancy, which had apparently done significant philanthropic work in rural BC. "They're quiet," Sasha said. "Not a lot of public profile, but I've heard they're solid. The principal, a guy named Fitch, he's been involved in a few conservation land deals up north." "I don't have much on him." Catherine asked her to send an email introducing the opportunity. She didn't think much about it. She had 12 other calls to make that week. Norman received the email on a Tuesday morning and read it on his phone while standing at the edge of a property near Williams Lake. The property was 4,400 acres of mixed boreal forest, and he had spent the morning walking part of it with his land assessor, a methodical woman named Frances, who wore the same vest every field day regardless of weather. He read the email twice. It was a well-written email, specific about the cause, honest about the funding gap, clear about what sponsorship would involve. He forwarded it to his assistant and asked her to set up a call. Norman had built Harrow Land Consultancy over 26 years. It had started as a one-man operation assessing resource land in the BC interior, and it had grown, slowly, deliberately, without fanfare, into something considerably larger. Harrow currently held interests in 11 land parcels across Western Canada, totaling just under 90,000 acres, a number Norman found accurate but abstract, because he still walked every property himself at least once a year. He had 3 full-time staff members and worked out of a small office in Burnaby that looked, from the outside, like a contractor's satellite operation. There was no logo on the door. He did not appear in business directories if he could avoid it. He had been asked twice to speak at industry conferences and had declined both times without explanation. When people asked what he did, he said land development in the same neutral tone one might say accounting or logistics, and he allowed them to draw whatever conclusion was most comfortable. James had once asked him why he didn't just tell people. Norman had thought about it for a moment. "Because then they'd talk to me differently," he said, "and I like people better before they know." The call between Norman and Catherine lasted 17 minutes, she explained the gala. He asked 3 questions. What was the foundation's overhead ratio? How were literacy outcomes measured? Was the shortfall a one-year issue or a structural one? She answered all 3 directly, which he appreciated. Most people in fundraising talked around his questions. She did not. He said he would think about it and get back to her by end of week. She thanked him and moved on with her day, mentally placing this call in the possible but uncertain column. 3 days later, his assistant sent an email confirming Harrow Land Consultancy's sponsorship of the gala at the $200,000 level, with a brief note that Norman Fitch would attend as the representative. There were no conditions, no naming requirements, no request for table placement near the podium. Sasha brought the email to Catherine's office and placed it on her desk. Catherine read it and then read it again and said, "That was faster than I expected." "I know," Sasha said. "Do we have anything more on him?" Sasha hesitated. "Not really. He doesn't have a website. The company is registered in BC. No press mentions I can find. He paid by wire transfer same day." Catherine nodded slowly. "All right. Make sure he has a good seat." The gala was on a Thursday evening in the third week of November. Norman wore a suit. It was a good suit, charcoal gray, well cut, bought perhaps 6 years ago from a tailor in Yaletown who had since retired. He had not worn it since a funeral, and he'd had it dry cleaned for the occasion. He drove to the Fairmont in the Civic, handed the key to a valet, who managed his expression well, and walked into the ballroom with the same unhurried quiet he brought to everything. The room was spectacular. Catherine had been right to be proud of it. The tables dressed in ivory and deep green, the lighting low and warm, the silent auction items arranged along the east wall with tasteful signage. There were perhaps 300 people. Norman recognized the texture of the room. Serious money, performing generosity, which was still generosity, and therefore worth something. He found his table, which was well positioned, third from the front, good sight lines to the stage. He introduced himself to the other guests at the table, a couple from West Vancouver, a woman who worked in municipal policy, a man who ran a renewable energy firm out of Calgary. He was pleasant. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He did not mention what he did. Catherine worked the room with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. She stopped at every table, said the right things, laughed at the right moments. She reached his table near the end of the pre-dinner reception. "Mr. Fitch," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Catherine Aldrin. Thank you so much for coming, and for your support." Norman shook her hand. "It's a good cause," he said. The email was well written. She thanked him and began the automatic social scaffolding, asking what had drawn him to the cause, mentioning the program updates she planned to share during dinner. She was professional. She was warm. She was also, in some corner of herself she would not have acknowledged at the time, slightly condescending, not in what she said, but in how she calibrated her attention. She had spent the evening allocating herself in roughly descending order of perceived importance. Norman Fitch was $200,000, which was significant, but he had no public profile and wore a 6-year-old suit and offered nothing in the conversational way of industry connections or board presences. She spent about 4 minutes at his table. This was not enough. She moved on with a warm smile, and the Calgary man made a comment about networking fatigue, and the conversation turned to hockey. The program began at 8. The executive director of the Literacy Foundation spoke with genuine feeling about the children the program served, and there was a short video, and then Catherine took the stage. She was a good speaker, clear, specific, grateful without being sentimental. She thanked the sponsors by name. When she reached Harrow Land Consultancy, she said, "Our newest and valued partner," with a slightly upward inflection, the way one indicates something pleasantly unexpected. Norman watched from his table. He was drinking water. He applauded when the moment called for it. After the program, dinner was served, and the auction results were announced, and by any measure the evening was a success. The final number, announced near 10 o'clock, was $460,000. The room responded generously. Catherine was still at the front when the number was announced, standing beside the executive director, and she felt the particular satisfaction of something large being done well. She scanned the room and her eyes landed briefly on Norman's table. He was talking to the municipal policy woman. He looked entirely relaxed. He looked like a man with nowhere particular to be who found the company pleasant. Something about it caught her briefly, and then she turned back to the executive director and began discussing the logistics of the check presentation. It was Sasha who found the article. She came into Catherine's office on the Monday morning after the gala with her phone held slightly out, the way people hold things they're not sure how to present. "I found something," she said. About Fitch. The article was from a regional business journal in Prince George. Not widely read, not widely indexed, which explained why it hadn't surfaced in earlier searches. It was from 3 years ago, covering a significant conservation land deal in northern BC, in which a private land company had partnered with a First Nations band to protect and co-manage a 34,000-acre watershed. The deal was described as one of the largest private conservation agreements in the province that decade. The private land company was Harrow. The article mentioned Norman Fitch by name once, in the second-to-last paragraph. It quoted him as saying only, "The land will be better for it." Sasha scrolled further and showed Catherine a second result, a provincial government document publicly available, listing Harrow Land Consultancy as a registered holder of interests across multiple BC and Alberta parcels. The aggregate acreage figure was noted. Catherine read it and was quiet for a moment. "He didn't say anything," she said. "No," Sasha agreed. Catherine thought about the 4 minutes she had spent at his table. She thought about the upward inflection in her voice when she'd mentioned his company from the stage. Our newest and valued partner, like he was a pleasant footnote. She thought about her comment at Lonsdale, back in October, to Malcolm. I wonder if he wandered in thinking this was the pub down the street. She had not known then that she was speaking about the same man who would later rescue her Gala's funding shortfall with a same-day wire transfer and no conditions. But that wasn't what stayed with her. What stayed with her was simpler and harder to argue with. She had seen a man in a flannel shirt and made a joke at his expense, and she had been wrong about everything except the shirt. She put Sasha's phone down on the desk. "Can you get me his direct email?" she said. Norman was at the Williams Lake property again when Catherine's email arrived. He was standing on a ridge looking at a section of second-growth timber that Francis had flagged as a candidate for selective harvesting, and his phone buzzed in his vest pocket, and he did not look at it until he was back at the truck. The email was short. "Mr. Fitch, I wanted to thank you again for your generosity at the gala and your support of the Literacy Foundation. I also owe you a more honest acknowledgement. I didn't give your company the attention it deserved when we were arranging the evening. I've since read more about Harrow and your work, and I regret that. I hope there may be an opportunity to have a more substantive conversation at some point." Catherine Aldrinhe read it twice. Then he sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the timber line. He appreciated that she had written it. He appreciated more that she had written it plainly, without too much explaining or too much apologizing, both of which could be forms of making the moment about oneself. She had sympathized what was true. He typed a short reply. "Ms. Aldrin, thank you. I thought the evening was very well run. The executive director's remarks were the best part. I'd be glad to talk at some point if something useful comes of it. N." Fitch put the phone away and got out of the truck and walked back to where Frances was waiting with her notes, and they spent another hour on the ridge. They did eventually have a more substantive conversation. Catherine called him in January, ostensibly about a rural hospitality property she was considering for her investment group, a former fishing lodge near Quesnel that had potential as an eco-retreat. She wanted his read on the land. He agreed to take a look. They drove up together in late February, she in a rented SUV that she'd offered to drive, he with a set of topographical maps he'd printed at the office in Burnaby. He walked the property with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. He pointed out a creek drainage issue she hadn't noticed and a stand of mature pine that had more value than the appraisal had indicated. On the drive back, she asked him directly, "Why don't you have a website or any public presence at all?" Norman thought about it. "I did once," he said. "Early on. It didn't change anything useful. It might bring you more clients. I have what I need," he said. She looked at the road for a while. "Does it ever frustrate you? When people don't take you seriously?" "Sometimes," he said. "Less than it used to." She thought about this. Outside, the interior plateau rolled by, brown and enormous and indifferent to everyone's opinion of it. "I misjudged you pretty badly," she said. Not quite an apology, something quieter than that, an admission. Norman was quiet for a moment, not because he was deciding whether to be gracious about it. He'd already decided that. He was quiet because what he wanted to say felt worth saying carefully. "I think most people do," he said finally. "I've spent a long time not minding, but I'll tell you something. It's worth noticing when you do it, not because of me, because of all the times you probably didn't notice, and those were the ones that cost someone something." Catherine didn't say anything. The road curved north, and the sky over the plateau had gone the color of old pewter, and there was snow somewhere ahead, visible on the higher ridges. She thought about Brianna's hesitation at the hostess podium. She thought about the charity table calibrated by perceived importance. She thought about how many rooms she'd worked in her life, and how precise her system of allocation had been, and how quietly confident she'd been that it was accurate. "You're right," she said. "I know," Norman said without particular emphasis. Not cruelty, not satisfaction. Just the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who had been telling the truth. They drove the rest of the way mostly in silence, which was by then a comfortable one. The Quesnel property was not what Catherine decided, in the end, to pursue. The drainage issue was more significant than it first appeared, and the remediation costs eroded the margin she needed. Norman's assessment had been correct, which she told him directly, and he accepted this with the same equanimity he seemed to bring to everything. James Fitch married Rosalind Cheng the following June, in a small ceremony in Kitsilano, with the garden just coming into its early summer fullness. Norman sat in the front row in the same charcoal suit, dry cleaned again. Howard Cheng, who by then had spent several evenings with Norman over dinner at James and Rosalind's apartment, leaned over before the ceremony began and said, "Your son is a remarkable young man." "I know," Norman said. "He got it from his mother." Howard laughed, and Norman smiled, and the music began. And James came in from the side door looking exactly like a man who understood he was the luckiest person in the room. Norman watched his son walk toward the person he loved, and he thought that some things accumulate slowly, without announcement. A parcel here, a decade there, a life built in the quiet between the moments anyone else thinks to look. And when they finally see it, they are surprised, which is their problem and not yours. He thought about Tyler. He thought about James. He thought about his wife, who would have cried through the entire ceremony and denied it afterward. He did not think about the flannel shirt. He had 4 more like it at home, and he planned to wear them for a long time yet.